Okay, we're going to go through the behavioral skills training model. If you haven't done so, stop the recording now and read chapter 12 in the Milton-Berger textbook. So behavioral skills training has been around for a long time. Most of you are probably familiar with it, even if you haven't used that term to describe it. It's been around since the 1960s, and it's a very heavily research-based model for teaching certain kinds of skills to individuals with special needs, as well as staff or other professionals. So it's been has a wide variety of applications for which it's successful. And it's just a good set of skills to have, especially if you do a lot of staff training. I was introduced to it when I first became a behavior analyst. My very first job, I did a lot of staff training on how to implement behavior intervention plans, and I was taught how to use the behavioral skills model. And in my early experience, I took some shortcuts. I was new to the field, and I did a couple of sessions with my supervisor. And to shortcut, I eliminated some of the components because I didn't truly appreciate their importance. And my supervisor noticed that some of the people I had trained were not implementing the interventions appropriately, whereas the ones that he had trained were implementing it well. So we had a discussion, and I fessed up that I had skipped the role play and feedback part because I had just had it in my head that I could describe something and I could model it and demonstrate it, and if people could answer questions about it, they'd be able to do it. I was wrong. So that was an important learning experience for me. All of these parts are really essential. And there's research to show that when you eliminate any one of them, you're going to see a decrease in the effectiveness of your training. So what is behavioral skills training? Well, it's used to teach new skills or new behaviors. It's most effective for behaviors that can be simulated in a role play. For instance, if you were going to teach some kind of cognitive strategy, this would not be, you would have to adapt this. This wouldn't be the best method. So it needs to be something that you can actually observe someone else doing and give them feedback on it. Prerequisite skills, the learners need to be able to follow verbal instructions. I think it would be more difficult if they could not. And they would have to... Generally, you would use behavioral skills training with learners who don't require more intensive kind of prompting, like system of least prompts, or the fading or the chaining procedures. So people that can follow verbal instructions and imitate really well, you can use behavioral skills training with them. So you can use it with individuals with special needs if they have milder disabilities, or you can use it with staff training. You can do it individually, and there's research that it's effective with groups. Behavioral skills training, my personal experience has been with staff, and I have done primarily group instruction. So, it's a little self-assessment. Behavioral skills training is used to teach new behaviors that can be simulated in a, like you said, role play. And to use behavioral skills training, the learner has to be able to follow blank and imitate blank, follow instructions and imitate models. Some examples, there's research that shows effective use of behavioral skills trainings with teaching parenting skills, assertiveness training, teaching abduction prevention skills to young children. Teaching social skills is probably the method that most people are familiar with. Most social skills curricula, the model they use is actually behavioral skills training, although they typically don't say so. But most of the, certainly skill streaming and some other good social skills models follow the steps of behavioral skills training. The components are verbal instructions, and verbal instructions are usually supplemented with written text. Sometimes people will use other visuals along with the verbal instructions. And the verbal instructions usually start out with some kind of rationale or reason to put things in context, like why is this skill important? The instructions are followed immediately by the instructor modeling the behaviors that are being taught. And sometimes some of the instructions are given at the same time that you're doing the modeling. So immediately after the modeling, you have either one or more of the participants role play or rehearse the skill that was just modeled. And during or following that role play, you provide feedback to the learner or learners if you're doing it with a group. If you're doing it with a group, it's best that you have every single person participate during every session. Don't let people get into a pattern of sitting back and just watching. It has to be, everyone has to be actively involved. The feedback, which we'll discuss in a little more detail later, I always start with giving feedback about what the person did correctly, and then follow that up with some kind of error correction. Like generally I might have the person redo parts that they were having trouble with. So the feedback would include me modeling that component and then having the learner just imitate that one component again. And then sometimes you would give another example and have the person rehearse that, or sometimes you would just have a different person come up and rehearse something. So let's look at each component individually. The instructions have to be at a level that the participant understands them. So that means if you're working with staff, you're not going to use jargon or terminology that the person is not going to be familiar with. If you're working with children, of course, you're not going to use examples that are too abstract, or you're not going to use vocabulary that is beyond that kid. So you need to individualize it to the group for whom you're conducting the training. Based on the work that Bandura did, we discussed him a little when we were talking about video modeling. Well, the other things about modeling that Bandura learned in his research are relevant here. The person who is doing the model needs to be someone who is credible. So it's someone that the participants perceive as being credible, or someone that they would look up to. Usually it's a good idea if I'm doing behavioral skills training. I'm actually going to be doing some training this week with a group of paraprofessionals at a school district. And I'm going to be talking about how to work with students during unstructured times. That's the focus of the training. So I'm going to start out by describing some of my own experiences working with children and just some of the different things I've done. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to establish myself as someone that has some idea of what I'm talking about. So I want to have some kind of credibility with that group of people before I start doing the behavioral skills training. You also need the opportunity to rehearse the behavior. So again, when my first attempts at using this, I did the modeling, but I didn't fully understand that every participant needed to actually rehearse it right then. Like my reasoning, I think, was that they're going to have lots of opportunities to try this and actually do it. No, it needs to happen right then. And then you'll see that some people may have picked up on parts of the skill, but maybe there are other nuances that they did not pick up on. So you'll be able to repeat instructions and modeling again, to use error correction to get everyone performing the skill, at least in that session, the way it should be performed. Now, in reality, you need to follow up and actually observe people in the real setting and provide feedback as well. Research shows that that's the only way this is really effective. But at this step, you want to see the skill modeled by the learner or rehearsed. Then you provide extra feedback. If there's some really critical component of the skill, or if the skill involves paying, making some decision. So if this, then this, so there's a decision rule. Or again, if it's something really critical, be sure you get the learner's attention. So at those times I might just stop everybody and okay, this is really important. I need to watch for this. And then I would model doing that. So good planning is important, as with any kind of effective instruction, but consider things the learner would really need to attend to, and then make notes. I usually will put an asterisk by those steps so that I know to give some kind of attentional cue when I'm teaching. So if we're going to self-assess here, instructions must be given by a person with, did you say ability? That's instructions must be given when the learners are paying money? Nope. Attention. Alrighty. So we got the instruction part down. The modeling part, again, as with any kind of modeling, people tend to be more imitative if they view the model as being someone with high status or someone that they connect with. They view him as being similar. So I'm going to be talking with paraprofessionals, and I'm going to share with those people that I spent a good deal of time working as a classroom assistant in a classroom. And when I was a classroom assistant, I basically did what the teacher told me to, and there were some times when I didn't agree with it, but I was fortunate enough that I was part of a team and I got to have input. So I will share with them that I was in that role and some of the things that I did when I was working as a classroom assistant. So I was a type of paraprofessional when I was in school. Hopefully they view me as somebody credible. They probably are not going to see me as somebody with high status, because I don't see myself that way. I go for credible. When you do modeling, another important aspect that some people don't understand. So when you're modeling something, let's say you're modeling a social skill or a problem-solving skill. So I'm going to be talking about working with kids in unstructured situations. I'm going to have some participants come up and play the role of the student. When I first model those skills, I'm going to instruct the people who are helping me to basically behave appropriately when I ask them to, because I want to show these skills as being successful. And some people don't understand that. They say, well, it's not going to work every time you do it, and is this realistic if you just show it working every time? Well, we do hope that this works most of the time, or we wouldn't be teaching it. And if someone's going to imitate it, they need to see the person who is modeling the skill, they need to see it actually working. If I start out and just model it not working, chances are very slim that the person's actually going to try to use this. Now, as I go on and people practice more, then I can start throwing in some negative examples, and I can show it not working, and I can talk about problem solving. Okay, if this doesn't work, then this is what you can try. But initially, you always show the skill working. That's your foundation. You build on that later. If you don't show the person being successful in the model right away, research shows that there's a very low probability that someone's going to imitate. So show the learner being successful, or in other words, show the behavior being reinforced by effectiveness. Sort of goes without saying that you adjust the complexity of what's being modeled to the ability of the learner. So if someone's new to a skill, or if it's someone with special needs, you break the skill down into smaller steps. You give it in manageable pieces. We already talked about the learner needing to pay attention. Use attentional cues. Use breaks. Do what you need to do to keep people engaged. I always try to use some humor when appropriate to get people more engaged, and I ask a lot of questions. Just having people coming up and doing the role play also keeps people more engaged. So with the modeling, if you can model behaviors in context, that works better. For example, if I'm going to teach someone how to make purchasing skills and I can actually go to a store and model it, that's better. If that's not practical, though, then I need to simulate that environment as much as possible. So this week when I do the staff training, I'm going to be probably doing a lot of simulation because we're just going to be in one training area. But I'm going to describe the context as much as I can. When you do the modeling, you want to provide opportunities for immediate role play and rehearsal. So generally the way I do it is I will present the skill, I'll give the rationale, I'll explain it. Then I will model the skill, and I may have someone come up to assist me when I model it. Then I do some role play. I'll have one person step in and take on my role and role play it in front of the group. Then I'll ask the group to provide feedback about whether that person did the skill. I'll ask the group, okay, what did this person do well? And I'll get 2 or 3 people's responses. And I say, okay, now what could we do better? And then I'll get maybe 1 or 2 responses. Then I will model any parts that the group mentioned, and then I'll add anything that I wanted to add about the person's performance. And then I'll give them another chance to repeat the same thing again. So you want to end on the person performing the skill appropriately. Then I'll have another couple of people come up and go through another role play situation and get feedback from the group. Depending on how quickly people seem to be grasping it, I may do a third role play, but usually if I'm working with staff training, I will have people work in small groups if I have enough space, and then just do a few rehearsals themselves, and I just float around and answer questions and give feedback. So after everybody's had a chance to rehearse something a few times, then I move on to something else. I'm not sure I'm going to do another self-assessment here. I really set this up so that if we were having a synchronous class, you guys could respond to it. We changed our plans. So a model should be provided by a person with high blank to a learner. Well, that would be a high status to a slower learner. The model behavior should be reinforced. They be successful. And after instructions in modeling, the learner must have the opportunity to rehearse the behavior. So you won't have to sit as soon as you see the model. So what's the purpose of the rehearsal? Well, rehearsal immediately after you got the instructions of the modeling, the person has the opportunity to practice it in the proper context. So what you want the person to experience is the situation or context being the discriminative stimulus, and then they practice the behavior in the context of that SD, and then it immediately gets reinforced. Then you provide corrective feedback if you need to. You have the person repeat something. So the feedback is important. And again, we talk about initially pointing out what the person did well. And I always do that. Even if the person did not do such a great job, you can always find something that the person did well, or at least adequately. And I make a big deal about that first. Then I point out things the person needs to improve. And even if the person did it extremely well, I will still always point out something for them to improve on. Now, the reason I do this is everyone in the group learns to expect those components in feedback. And as you do after a few role plays, people just relax more because they know what's going to happen. They're going to get a couple of comments about things they did well, and they're going to get a couple of comments about things they need to improve on. And I make a big deal about how the reason we're practicing this is so that we get better at it. And so it doesn't single people out if someone is not doing well and they get corrective feedback, well, everybody's getting corrective feedback. And the group being involved in giving feedback helps also, because then it's not so much just you as the instructor giving feedback, but it gets everyone involved in participating. Rehearsal occurs immediately after instruction modeling, and rehearsal should occur in proper context. All right, the feedback. Well, I've already talked about feedback a lot, so just a quick review here. So you give praise for correct performance. Always start with positive feedback, then give feedback on what the person needs to do better. When you give the corrective feedback, now the praise, hopefully you guys all understand that. Be descriptive. Say what the person actually did that they did well or adequately. So describe it. Describe why it was good. Do the same thing for the corrective feedback. Again, the point here is not to criticize, but you describe what the person needs to do. Don't go on and on about what the person didn't do. Focus on what the person needs to do, and usually follow that immediately with modeling it. And sometimes, just to make that connection, I might briefly give a rationale there about why it's important to do it that way. Then I'll have the person practice it again, just that one part. So when correct behavior occurs, provide praise immediately. Always provide some praise. You can always find something to praise. Feedback involves praise for correct performance and instructions for improvement. So the other part is generalization. We want to be sure that we're teaching skills such that the person is going to be able to apply them in a real-world setting. So use realistic role plays that actually simulate the range of situations a person may encounter. So when I was teaching social skills to kids with emotional and behavioral disorders, I would get sort of a sampling from them about situations they had been in where they might have gotten in trouble. The first thing I'm going to do Thursday when I do the training is I'm going to get some examples of situations people have dealt with, and I'm going to work those into our role play situations. So as much as you can, incorporate real-life examples into your training. That's going to, well, first of all, it's going to give you more credibility. People are going to see it as more relevant to their jobs. And it's also going to affect the extent to which the skills are going to generalize to real-life settings. Now, to really make this happen, you need to, or someone needs to observe these individuals actually using these skills in the real world, and then do the same corrective feedback. So you need to reinforce them for using components correctly, and then give them feedback on what they need to do differently, and possibly go in and model it. When I was working as a behavior analyst, and I would use this model to teach staff, we would do role plays of all the interventions for all of the students we were working with, and then I would go into the settings and watch them implement the interventions. And sometimes I was able to actually go in and model working with the kid. I knew the students. There were kids that were on my caseload, so I would model actually doing the interventions, and then have the staff practice it with the actual student. When that wasn't possible, I would still give them feedback, and I would talk with them. Now, it was really important I developed good relationships with the staff with whom I was working. My last job, I get choked up even when I talk about this, but was a behavior analyst at the New Jersey Center for Autism, and I left there to go back to school and get my doctorate. I had two parties. I had the professional staff took me out to lunch, and then after the staff, the paraprofessionals that worked there wanted to take me out too, so they took me out for a drink, and I waited around. So this was like 7:00 at night, and they gave me a card when they and there was a very nice card thanking me for all the support I'd given them over the last few years, and there was a check in there for $300. So the paraprofessionals that worked there that made a lot less money took up a collection to support me going back for my education. That really meant a lot to me, that those people wanted to do that. And I think to a lot of extent I had worked very hard to develop a positive relationship with them, and I wanted them to see me as someone who was there to help them. So I think it's important to have that kind of relationship when you're working with other people and you want to facilitate them actually implementing interventions. In situ, I'm not sure I ever pronounced this right, but in situ training simply means you're training within the situation in which the person needs to use the skill. And I always incorporated this as part of the generalization. So in situ assessment means that you're actually assessing the skill in the context, and in situ training means that you are teaching and modeling and reinforcing the skill in the actual setting. So if you think in terms of behavioral skill training and the behavioral model, we think of it the three-term contingency that we apply to everything else. So we have the antecedent, which would be the discriminative stimulus, and then sometimes a motivating operation. The behavior that we're teaching, and then the consequences. Well, what's the reinforcer? Well, if we're teaching a skill like a behavioral intervention to staff, the antecedent, the SD, is the situation where the person needs to implement it. So it may be the kid behaving in a certain way or a certain environmental context. The behavior is that would be the steps in implementing the intervention or whatever skill. And then the consequence would be possibly some feedback for correct performance, but I think the long-term consequence is you start to see improvement in the behavior of the individual with whom you're working. So, to look at it here, it says that it's praise, but I'm not sure that praise from your supervisor is always a reinforcer that maintains your behavior if you're implementing interventions. People that are effective, the improvement of the kid is a real reinforcer. And I always try to stress that with folks. That's really what this is all about. As we said before, you can do behavioral skills training in groups also. I think we already discussed most of this, but again, let me stress it's important to get everyone involved. You need to establish right away that everyone participates. There's always going to be some people that want to just kind of sit back and watch, and you need to establish right away that everyone is going to be involved in role play and practice, and everybody's going to be involved in giving feedback. So the people that sort of would sit back and not respond when I asked for feedback, those are the folks I'd call on next to role play. So don't let people get into that pattern. Once you establish that everybody's going to take a turn, then you pretty much eliminate that problem. But if you don't address it right away, you're always going to have people that don't want to be actively involved. And it's really critical for this model that everyone rehearses so that everybody gets feedback. So, we're going to use behavioral skills training. What are the steps we follow? Well, first of all, we identify and we define the skills that we're going to teach. We make sure that these are relevant to the learners and that they've been adequately broken down so that they fit the ability of the learners. Next, we need to identify the relevant discriminative stimuli. So what are the cues that the learner needs to attend to know when it's time to perform this skill? Sometimes we might need to make these more obvious in the beginning. We might need to make them stand out more. If we have the advantage of teaching in the actual setting, that makes this a lot easier because you can actually use the SDs that are there. Many times when we're doing staff training in groups, though, we just have to describe and use visuals to highlight the SDs. It's important to assess where the learner is before you start doing the training for several reasons. If you start modeling and having people imitate stuff that they already know how to do really well, they're going to get frustrated and they're going to see it as a waste of time. So establish where the learners are and where you need to start. So you may end up revising the skill the way that you're going to teach it and combining steps of it if you see that the learners already have some of those skills. Sometimes it's best to begin training with the easiest skill or situation first, and the reason is you want to establish some success really early. Don't start with the most difficult one. Start with something that's easy. You want to establish success followed by reinforcement. Describe the behavior and model it in a realistic role-play context. So, again, if you're not in the actual setting, which many times you're not, then you have to add more descriptions about context. Give some thought about the examples. The examples you choose are really important. As we said before, you want them to be as relevant as possible to the situations that the learners are going to encounter. Number 6, always allow the learner to rehearse the behavior in a role-play context. I learned firsthand that you can't omit this step. If you do, you're probably going to end up being half as effective, or probably less than you would have been if people had been able to rehearse. So have people rehearse, then provide feedback. You start out with praise for parts of that they did correctly, and then you provide corrective feedback. You describe the behavior that needs to be improved. And again, sometimes a reason why. Describe it and then actually model it, then have the learner actually show you that step again. You may repeat this process a few times. Probably I would only do it a couple of times with that person. You don't want to frustrate the individual. And then I would switch to someone else and give another example. Sometimes we're just teaching the same steps over and over with different examples. As with different role plays, or as you have several role plays in a session, by the end people should be able to do it pretty independently. At least that's what you hope. And program for generalization, what we mean by that is use a lot of different examples that the individuals may encounter. When possible, teach in the settings where the skill is going to be used. At the very least, arrange for someone to observe and give feedback to individuals on site when they're actually using the skills. It really takes that for generalization to happen. There's a lot of research showing that if you just do modeling and role play sessions with feedback, many individuals will not generalize those skills unless they get modeling and feedback in the actual context in which they're going to learn the